Hi, and welcome to Module 6. Hopefully, Module 5 went very smoothly. Hopefully, you were able to figure out the virtual desktop and get your bearings to SPSS. And now we are going to move forward in Module 6. Just a quick note before we get started with the SPSS portion of Module 6. Make sure you check out the PowerPoint, which is under Modules. And this should all look very familiar to you. It's been following the same basic structure of the class. But there is a bivariate relationships PowerPoint that'll explain in some detail some of the concepts that are going over in these next 3 chapters in the Adventure and Social Research book. Real quick, a couple things about the PowerPoint. We are looking at bivariate relationships right now, and because of the prefix bi, it's pretty easy to understand that we're going to be looking at 2 variables instead of a single variable or univariate relationships like we were in Module 5. Univariate relationships just look at single variables. They look at descriptions. You can give percentages or means or medians or modes, those central tendencies that we talked about before, but you can't really talk about a relationship between that variable with anything else because you're only looking at a single variable. With bivariate relationships, we are starting to look at 2 variables. So now we can talk about if 2 variables are associated or related to one another. So if one variable helps predict the value of another variable, we can also talk about the strength of the variables or the strength of that prediction. So how accurate of a prediction do you get by knowing a value on one variable with another variable? So this is where independent and dependent variables come into play. We talked about this at the beginning of this course. Remember, independent variables are our predictor variables, and they predict our dependent variables or our outcome variables. So we're actually getting into predicting or looking at relationships between variables. In Module 7, we will also go over bivariate relationships. We'll go over in a little more detail. What you're going to go over in Module 6 is very, very basic and a very crude way to look at bivariate relationships. And eventually in Module 8, we'll get into what we call multivariate relationships, and that's when we look at 3 or more variables together and explain how 3 or more variables impact an outcome. So make sure you check out that PowerPoint. It's a PDF just like you've had for the other modules. If you have any questions on that, let me know. Shoot me an email, give me a phone call, and we can walk through that. To make Module 6 a little easier, the book refers back to some variables that they had you recode in Chapter 7, and many of you may not have saved that data set. And so I have gone through and I've recoded some of the variables that we will actually use, and I have the data set ready for you to go here. So when you open your book and you start walking through the exercises in your book, which we're going to do right now, open this data set. So all you have to do is click on chapters 10, 11, and 12 data set. Again, make sure you're in the virtual desktop. If you're not in the virtual desktop and you don't have SPSS on your personal computer, this won't work. So make sure you're in the virtual desktop as you go to Canvas, and then you can hit just that save link, that .sav link, and we can wait for SPSS to load. What you're going to notice in these next 3 chapters is that they're having you do a lot of repetitions. So you might be able to do 5 or 6 of these, and then eventually you might be done. So you may not actually have to go through every single exercise that they have in this chapter if you don't want to. But they're just trying to reiterate. Oops, got really teeny. They're just trying to hammer in what they're doing here. Sorry about that, guys. Let's see if it stopped there. Very good. Now we're good. So, no, we're not. Now we're good. All right, so again, bivariate relationships, we're looking at the relationship between 2 variables. And so one way you can do this is by running what we call a crosstab. So a crosstab is just going to give you basically a frequency table and with percentages, and you're going to be able to look at those percentages and determine if there's a relationship between the 2 variables and very crudely determine the strength of that relationship. So if you start looking through the chapter on chapter 10, if you turn to page Excuse me. If you turn to page 160 through 161, you will see that we are going to look at the relationship between sex and gender and church attendance. Now, church attendance is a variable that they had you recode in chapter 7. So again, if you've opened it up with the chapters 10, 11, and 12 data set, you will not have to go back and recode that variable. So it's pretty important that you open the data set under module 6. So how we run a crosstab is all you're going to do is you're going to come up here to analyze, and then you're going to click descriptive statistics, and you're going to come down here and you will see crosstab. So it's pretty self-explanatory. So just analyze descriptives crosstab. You click on that. Now again, if you right click here, you can display the variable names, and if you right click again, you can sort them alphabetically. Just makes it a little easier to find and also helps you kind of follow the book a little bit more. So in this example, we are looking at whether or not knowing someone's gender can help you predict how often they go to church. So in that scenario, someone's gender or sex is the independent variable. And whenever we do crosstabs, we always put the independent variable in the columns box here. And then we will put the dependent variable, what we're trying to predict, which is church attendance, which they have labeled as chat with an extra T. You always put that in the row box. So independent variables always go in the columns. Dependent variable always goes in the row. So once you have your independent here and your dependent variable here, click on cells, and you're going to want to make sure that column percentages is checked. The default is to not have it checked, but we want to make sure that the column percentage is checked so that way we can actually make a comparison between our variables. So make sure you check column, click continue, click OK, and you will see that our output is now produced. So if you scroll down, you're going to see a box. Don't really worry about this first box up here. It's just telling you basically how many valid cases that you have and how many missing variables that you have or missing cases that you have. Not really something important that we need to focus on right now. Instead, you're going to look at this box right here. And so start looking at this box, and what you can see is if you look at the percentages across the rows, you're looking at a comparison across these rows to see if there's a substantial difference between the sexes and whether or not they go to church on a regular basis. So if you start looking at this, you will see that in About Weekly, you do see about 8% more females go to church About Weekly compared to males. If you look at monthly, you see that drops down to about 3%. If you look at seldom, you see more males are seldom going to church than women. And if you also look at never, you can see there's a substantial more men, whether or not they go to women. So if you kind of compare these percentages across the columns, you can see generally women are more likely to go to church often, and men are more seldom or never likely to go to church. Sometimes if you collapse categories even further than what you did in the recode, that comes even clearer. So if you look at About Monthly, if you add this 33 and the 17, you'll see about 50% of women go to church monthly or weekly. And you can see if you combine the seldom and number, you can see over 60% of men very seldom or never go to church. So I would make the argument, and again, this can be subjective depending on how many percentage points differences that you want, but I would make an argument that sex can help. It's not a very good predictor. It's not a one-for-one predictor. It's actually not even, it doesn't even appear to be a strong predictor. But there does appear to be some type of relationship between one's sex and church. And knowing somebody's sex, you may be able to better predict their church attendance. You would probably say females are more likely to go to church than men are. So the book has you go through a couple more. We'll just kind of walk through this. So again, you're just going to go to Analyze, Descriptives, Crosstabs. And the next thing that you're going to look at, or the next variable we're going to look at, is belief in the post-life, or belief in life after death. So, and we're also looking at whether or not gender predicts that as well. So we can leave sex in this column here because sex is going to remain our independent variable. But we're going to want to go down to post-life. And again, that's belief in life after death. As long as you don't reset it and you just do what I did, this column total should stay, or this column box should stay checked. But if you do reset it on accident, or if you're like me sometimes and you just want to double check, you can just click on that cells box right here and make sure it's checked. So click OK, and we can scroll down again. Don't worry about this box right here. This is the box or the table that we are actually particularly interested in. And what you're going to look at is whether or not there is a difference between men and women and whether or not they believe in life after death. So you can see it's not a huge difference. Again, it's about that 8% a difference again, but females are more likely than men to believe in life after death. And males are less likely to believe in life after death. So you can say that there may be a slightly higher percentage of people. So it suggests that women are a little more likely to believe in life after death. Now, when looking at the strength of the association, like I said before, some people in the book relates to, a 10 percentage rule, saying that it's not a strong relationship unless there's 10 percentage points difference here. Other people say it's 5, other people say it's 6. That's very, very subjective. And what you will see next week when we get into Module 7, there are more accurate ways besides crosstabs that can help you discern whether or not there is a statistically significant relationship between these two variables. But for right now, we're just doing crosstabs so you can kind of get the understanding of whether or not there's a relationship between variables. So on the next one that they want you to look at, or the book has you kind of walk through, is they're looking at how often people pray and whether or not sex predicts how often people pray. So again, we're going to go to crosstabs. We're going to leave sex right here in our independent variable. We're going to get rid of post-life, and we're going to move down to pray. Again, if you want to check that cells tab, it should stay the same. Click OK. Again, ignore that first box up top, that case processing summary. And you can come down here and you can see how often someone prays is what we call an ordinal variable. So there's a lot more categories on this. Male, female, or sex is a dichotomous variable. So you're going to have a box, or you're going to have a line for each category of your ordinal variable. So sometimes these tables can get quite large. So if we start looking at this between males and females, we're looking at how often people pray. If you use that rule of 10, as the book alluded to, you could see there's a significant sex difference here because the difference between 21.9 and 34.8 is greater than 10, with females being more often to pray several times a day. You still see a difference in once a day, but it doesn't hit that 10% threshold. But again, that is subjective. When you get to several times a week, you see men are more often to pray several times a week compared to women. Men are more often to do once a week. Men are more often to have at least once a week, or less than once a week, I'm sorry. And men are more often for never. So if you look at how these percentages fall in the once a day or several times a day, women are substantially more likely to pray at least once a day, while men are substantially more likely to never pray or pray less than once a week. So one could argue that gender or sex actually has a relationship with how often someone prays. So just knowing someone's sex or gender can predict how often they pray. It doesn't mean it's a one-for-one prediction. It doesn't really mean that if you're a woman, you're going to pray once a day or at least once a day. But we can say women in general are more likely to pray at least once a day when they're compared to their male counterparts. Right? So they then have you in chapter 10, we're now on page 167, have you start looking at different types of crosstabs. So in the next crosstab, which is demonstration 10.4, you're going to look at religiosity and age. Now again, age the category or the variable they're having you use here is a category that you recoded in chapter 7. And so I went ahead and in this data set recoded that for you. So again, we're going to go to Analyze, go to Descriptives, go to Crosstabs. We're getting rid of both pray and both sex. And what the book would like you to do is have age be our predictor or our independent variable and church attendance be our dependent variable. So what that's saying in layman's term is, does knowing someone's age help predict how often that person goes to church? So age cat is what you're going to use. That's your independent variable in columns, right? And church attendance, which I just passed, is going to be your dependent variable, and your dependent variable is in the row. Again, click cell, columns checked, click continue, click OK, and you can see this gets a little more hairy because we have more categories now on both our independent and our dependent variable. So our independent variable now has 4 categories. Our dependent variable also has 4 categories. So you're seeing many more cells in this box. As the categories increase on both the variables, you will see more cells. That's why in certain cases that crosstabs may not work, and we'll talk about that later in the semester of when crosstabs don't work. But again, with ordinal variables, what you're going to do is you're just going to kind of look across the percentages here and see if there's any type of relationship, if there's any type of pattern that you can see. Now, real quick on when you have ordinal variables like this, and remember ordinal variables have an order to them with multiple categories. If you see something where if it's along this diagonal right here, and if you look at page 168 in your book, you will see, a perfect example. You never see this in the real world. But if you see the categories, say this box, this box, this box, and this box all had the highest percentage in them in their respective rows, we would say that that is a perfect positive relationship. That means as your independent variable increases, automatically is your dependent variable increasing. Now, if you see the percentages here be consistently high in all your rows or each of your respective rows, we would say that is a negative relationship. And what we mean by a negative relationship means that as one variable increases, the values of the other variable decreases. So again, that's explained in your PowerPoint a little more clearly, and that's kind of a hypothetical. We don't really see that in the real world. Sometimes 3 of these cells, if we have 4 right here, 3 of these cells will kind of fall in line. And so we would say if we had 3 out of these 4 have the highest category, we would say it was a moderately strong negative relationship. If we had all 4, we would say it's almost a perfect, or it is a perfect negative relationship. And if they went this way, again, it's a positive relationship. So you're examining your output here, right? Start looking at the data here and see if anything kind of falls in line. So you can see when you look at age, older people, 65 and older, are more likely to go about weekly. When you start looking at monthly, you see people under 21 are more likely to go once a month. When you start looking at seldom, you see these numbers are actually pretty similar across the board for seldom. And you see younger people, 21 and younger, are more likely to never go to church. So if you kind of look at this, there's a weak relationship here. He would almost argue that, you know, older people are more likely to go to church than younger people, but that's not a very strong relationship. This is actually a pretty weak relationship because you don't have, like I said, those definitive lines in your blocks right here. So again, they want us to do this again. The book has you guys do this again for chapter 10. So this time they want you to look at recoded age and belief in life after death. So again, come to descriptives. Oh, I keep going to descriptives. Come to descriptives, crosstabs. Right, we're going to keep the age category, but they want you to look at post-life again, which we've already looked at before. And they also want you to look at how often one prays, so which is pray. So I'm going to do this together. So again, your age category, your category of age, is your independent variable. And you have two dependent variables this time, post-life and pray. When you set up your crosstabs like this, what is going to happen is you're going to get two crosstabs. So you'll get one crosstab that's examining age versus post-life, and then you'll get a second crosstab that is showing you age versus how often someone prays. So if you have multiple dependent variables that you're examining, this is one way to do it relatively quickly. Again, your cells should still be checked, or your column should still be checked. If you want to double check that, just click cells, click OK. And what you will see is the first one, I just passed it, is your belief in life after death with age. And then you will see you have a second crosstab that looks at age versus how often an individual prays. So again, if we look at belief in life after death and age, this is a very good example, as there's really no relationship between age and whether or not one believes in life after death. These numbers are extremely similar across the different variable, or across the different categories of age, both for yes and no. So because this is a very weak to no relationship, what that means is knowing someone's age doesn't help you better predict whether or not they believe in life after death. So this would be right here an example of two variables that are not highly related to one another. You start looking down at how often an individual prays. Let's look at that for a moment. So again, you're going to start looking at these boxes and see if you can see a difference between age and these categories amongst your respondents. So if you go over, you see the highest category for several times a day are 65 and older. If you look at once a day, the highest category is 30 for 65 and older. If you look at several times a week, you see that's 21 to 39. And then you see once a week is under 21. Less than once a week is under 21, and never is under 21. So again, like we looked at before, you can see that the older crowd, the 65 and older, and even here if you look at 40 to 64, so you could even say 40 and over, because you could collapse these two categories, are much more likely to pray at least once a day, whether it's once a day or several times a day. And your younger crowd, your 21 and under crowd, are less likely to pray, either once a week, less than a week, or never pray. So again, you could argue then that age does have a relationship with how often one prays, and that relationship indicates that older people are more often to pray at least once a day, while younger people are more often to pray once a week, less than once a week, or not pray at all. That is it for chapter 10. So we will stop there, and I will make another video which is going to be very similar to this, and so is chapter 11 and chapter 12. So these videos are going to be very similar to this. You're just going to kind of keep repeating this, try to keep interpreting these crosstabs to determine whether or not there is a relationship between two variables. So again, make sure you go over the PowerPoint, make sure you watch chapter 11 and 12's video. And if you have any questions and any comments or concerns, please shoot me an email or give me a phone call. Thank you. Have a good night. Bye-bye.